we had fought the Revolutionary War, the framers were faced with, what kind of government should we have? This is another area where you need to remember political eras. The people who were fighting the Revolutionary War were 100 years, some of them, removed from having had any real entanglements or personal involvements with Great Britain, which was a unitary system, which is very unlike the system that ultimately the framers created, which was a new system called federalism. So what is federalism? It's one of the most evolving kinds of governments we've been able to see. It was the first time we had a federal system in the world. It was one in which states and the national government played a role. Some powers to the national government were exclusive, and only the national government could perform them. Others were specific to the states, and the states were responsible for certain things. And then the states themselves had the opportunity to create smaller governments, but those existed solely at the discretion of states. So when we look at federalism in America, we look at it as a system where at each level, government derives their powers directly from the people. When the federal system was first adopted, when the Constitution was ratified, there were only 13 states. It's important to remember that. And those 13 states had, in many instances, thought of themselves as individual states. They knew they were going to be giving up some rights. They never, in a million years, thought they were going to be giving up the amount of rights that they ultimately did to the national government. But then we have to remember, we went from 13 to 50 states, which all had very different political cultures, have different systems of legislatures, have different rules about counties and school districts and special districts. We're in a situation where we have almost 90,000 separate governments, special districts, school districts, you name it, and there's a district for it. And then frequently there's somebody elected to run that district. But for the most part, states roll along year after year, enacting laws that affect the citizens of their states at the same time that the U.S. government has tremendously expanded its role into things that we originally thought were reserved powers to the states.
I think the federal government has the last word, just because the federal government can tell the states what to do at some points, while the state doesn't reciprocate that. The state doesn't have that power over the federal government.
The national government usually does have the last word. Not always. That's because the Constitution created a federal system. Most countries have a unitary system. Local, regional, or state governments get their authority from a single central government. Before the states adopted our Constitution, we had a confederal system, an alliance of states that granted limited powers to the national government. Today, our federal system divides power between the states and the federal government. But the supremacy clause in the Constitution makes the federal law supreme to state laws when the two conflict.
Money, monetary policy, fiscal policy, banking regulation. I think those are things that at a federal level we need to come to an agreement on, so we can sort of set a standard and be represented not only in country but outside of the U.S. as well.
The federal government, I think, is mainly there for military support. So I think my government is mainly there to make sure that the wars that we get into, or more importantly, the wars that we don't get into, remain at minimum.
The founders carefully listed specific powers that the national government should have. These are called enumerated powers. They include the power to declare war or to regulate commerce between states. But the founders also included a necessary and proper clause that allows Congress the power it needs to carry out its enumerated powers.
Right now they're trying to ban my ability to drink a large soda, but I would say more broadly they get to make decisions like education decisions at the state level. I think are really important. Every single state has different demographics, has different people who live there and different needs. So I think that a state should have a really, really vested interest in those decisions. Highways, for example. State highways, I think, need to be sort of maintained by the state by virtue of what they are.
States have a wide range of powers. The Constitution defines the powers of the national government and then gives all other powers to the states. These are called reserved powers. States must provide for the health, safety, and welfare of the residents. But state and national governments share some of the same powers. These are referred to as concurrent powers and include law enforcement or taxing. The Supremacy Clause within the Constitution establishes that when state law is in conflict with national law prevails.
I think it is good in some cases, especially when there's a need for social reform. For example, the civil rights movements of the 60s and 70s. It was when the federal government stepped in that there was this equality that we really needed, and some states didn't realize that. And I think it was good when the federal government stepped in.
And I would say there are certain things that need to be federally regulated. Things like currency, banking regulation, things like that, where there's some sort of federal voice. I do think it needs to be sort of brought together at the federal level. That's why we get to elect the people who represent us in Congress.
Some people think that Congress oversteps its authority by doing things that are not specifically enumerated in the Constitution. The Supreme Court provides checks on Congress to make sure it doesn't go too far in the use of the necessary and proper clause. However, Congress has used this clause to make policy in areas that would otherwise be managed by states under the reserved powers. In fact, the relationship between state and federal governments has evolved throughout America's history, and today, the federal government is much more powerful than it was in the time of the founders.
Generally speaking, the study of federalism is the study of the national government in relation to the state governments. We can expand the definition of federalism to include local government as well. In other words, we might think of it a more expansive definition of federalism that involves simply multi-level government in the United States. Because local governments are really creatures of the state, we ought first think about it as the federal government and the state governments. What is it that the federal government can compel states to do? This is federalism at its core. And federalism is the sort of connective tissue between the national government and the state governments. We have 50 different states, which means that we have 50 different politics, and all those 50 different politics need to relate with this one national government. To some extent, we have a choice of where we want to live. We can choose to live in New York or Arizona or California or Utah or Montana. In that sense, we get to pick our politics in a way that we don't get to pick the politics of the national government. There's a sort of multiple choice aspect to state politics. How then these governments interact with the national government is really important for understanding of the choices they make. The primary mechanism by which federal government controls state government is grants. That's the key thing. There's court cases, there's laws. What it comes down to is grants. It's all about grants. Different types of grants, but ultimately the mechanism by which federal government affects state policy is grants. And these grants affect Medicaid, they affect welfare, they affect all sorts of other programs, highways, for example. We have to realize that our own states, whether it's Texas or Montana or Maryland, all make policies, and these policies then are connected to the federal government via these grants. And the choices you make affect the grant levels you get, and they ultimately affect the quality of life you have in your own home state. Utah, Vermont, and Michigan, all in some way or another, and Florida to some extent, rejected No Child Left Behind. We have Utah saying, hey, listen, we got our own way of doing things. We're not saying the other way is better or worse, but we sort of reserve our authority to do this the way we want to do it. So when we talk about federalism and the differences between states, and thinking about how we live differently in different states, this is an education policy is an example of sort of that in action. Perhaps the area in which we've seen the most research has been welfare reform since 1996. Changes when the country switched from sort of a straight entitlement program to a block grant program. How did different states respond to this sort of options given to them? Another area of research is how national legislators, that is mostly Congress people, are dealing with issues of federalism. When we think about this for a second, it proposes sort of an interesting moment. Members of Congress have to make a choice. They want to get reelected. Many, particularly conservative congressmen, are elected on platforms of states' rights. But the question then becomes, once you're elected, is this a viable option to pursue as a member of Congress? Is this a viable way to get reelected? To support state rights in Congress is often a choice to choose policy inactivity over policy activity. We know that things like distributive benefits like pork are what get you reelected, and yet they're anathema to some of these states' rights policies. So I think that there's certainly room. There has been research on this. I think there's room for continued research and understanding how Congress people are dealing with these issues. What's interesting is that we have this sort of new evolving era of states' rights with the Tea Party, right? So now we have these new legislatures, some newly elected Congress people who come from Republicans that are sort of, say they're Tea Party members. Is that sort of connection to the Tea Party strong enough once they get to Congress to prevent them from sort of going the route of making national policy? They've been willing to do it because it seems politically popular at the moment. But that requires two things to be sustained. One, the sort of public preference needs for it to be sustained. And two, national legislators also need to be able to maintain sort of institutional independence to sort of push these sorts of reforms or sort of push against policy activity that potentially impacts states, whether it's more policies like healthcare reform, education reform, or things sort of on a much smaller scale like pork.
The U.S. Constitution gives the federal government limited authority and reserves powers for the states. The states have traditionally been responsible for implementing healthcare policy. In the 20th century, the federal government increased its role by providing funding to healthcare programs, which are a safety net for the poor and sick. In 2010, Congress passed the Patient Protection and Affordable Care Act, commonly called Obamacare. The purpose of the law is to expand healthcare coverage to most Americans, to improve public health, and to lower healthcare costs. But the act requires individuals and businesses to purchase healthcare insurance or else pay a penalty. Many people objected to the law, saying that the federal government had overstepped its authority. This raises a fundamental question. Should the federal government be allowed to mandate healthcare reform?
You know, everyone gets sick. Everyone needs to be healthy. No one should lose their life. No one should be denied health care because of pre-existing conditions.
The federal government should tell the states what to do because it's too many layers of politics in every state. And before the decision is made, they're on to another subject.
State rights are really more right-wing than people think. They think, oh, more freedom of choice. Why not? We should be able to choose as a state. But really, it's always reactionary. And particularly in terms of healthcare, it just makes no sense. Like, do less people get sick in Tennessee, than in New York? We all need healthcare. We should have federal healthcare legislation.
As you've heard, some people support Obamacare because they believe all people should have access to affordable and effective health care, no matter what their financial situation is. Supporters also believe that it is the federal government that should provide the safety net. They don't believe that states are capable of solving the problem efficiently, or they think that states won't act to solve the problem. Some people, however, disagree. Let's find out why.
Oh, absolutely not. I think that as a citizens of a
democratic country, we should have a choice.
So no, I don't believe that that's within their jurisdiction. They need to be worrying about keeping us safe, not about healthcare. The states understand their people. And so if one of the more liberal states wants to do something, then that's fine. The people have the right to move in or move out. And vice versa. If the conservative states want to maintain a more conservative approach, people have the right to move out or move back in. So I think that's where the power should be with regards to the people within the states.
People who oppose the act often argue against any government forcing individuals and businesses to purchase health care. Compulsory laws tend to go against the individualistic political values many Americans share. Other people also feel that health care should remain within the domain of state authority because each state has different priorities. Some states, for example, have more elderly populations. This and other factors mean that health care needs to vary from state to state. Does this mean that the federal government has no business interfering? In the summer of 2012, the U.S. Supreme Court upheld the Patient Protection and Affordable Care Act, ruling that the federal government did not exceed its authority by using its taxing and spending powers to mandate health care coverage. However, the majority opinion allowed states to opt out if they want to without penalty. This may undermine the goals of the initiative. By opting out, citizens in these states will remain uncovered, and those that opt in may not receive the benefits of cheaper costs. As the act is implemented, people will continue to question it. Should the federal government be allowed to force states, corporations, small businesses, and individuals to comply with the law? Is healthcare best left to the state and local levels because of variations within the population and ineffective state government? Or do we need more comprehensive reform at the federal level to ensure universal access to medical treatment?
If you were in public school 20 years ago in the United States, basically your state set what they wanted you to learn. And those standards of learning, as well as the length of the school year, the time of the day that you spent in class, were all state or frequently local issues that, under our federal system, it was believed that the states knew best. Southern schools got out earlier because there wasn't air conditioning, it was too hot to go to school, and people need to work on farms. In New York, students went to school almost an additional month. That creates difference. If you were, however, in England, everyone's school year would be starting on the same day. It would end at the same time. There would be national exams. You might have heard people refer to people's O levels or A levels that are a national standard to which everyone is held. Until the passage of No Child Left Behind Act, we had not had something that required local school districts, cities, school boards to require that teachers had certain kinds of certifications and that their students were making increased progress on an annual basis. It's a big difference if you live in a unitary system versus you live in a federal system. People who don't understand federalism will look at current debates today and go, well, why does somebody in Alabama have a different benefit than I do in Florida? And it's all on account of us being in a federal system that originally delegated responsibilities for health, education, and welfare to the states, where other governments that were unitary systems applied standards nationwide. So if you're someone who would like to have a same-sex partner, federalism becomes very important to you because you have to decide which state you might live in and might be able to get married in. Same thing about divorce. I mean, I hate to just keep talking about marriage, but every state has different rules for divorce. Some states, depending upon whether you have children, you have to be separated for 2 years. Other states don't believe in alimony. Other states have rules favoring mothers for custody of younger children. It's different in all 50 states. So things that you think really are almost personal become state laws and then affect you if they involve something that affects your life.